So we're coming to the end of World War II, and we're finding ourselves at the dawn of a new era, which comes to be known as the Cold War, which is a struggle between the United States and the USSR. We remember that at the end of World War II, we have on one side the Allied powers, composed of the Americans, the British, and the French, that are pushing in on Germany from the west, and from the east we have the Soviet Union that's pushing in. And the Allied powers could see that the end was in sight. So they met up at what was called the Yalta Conference, which was a Soviet resort in the Black Sea, the Big Three, in February of 1945. So the Big Three are FDR, representing the United States, Churchill, representing Great Britain, and Stalin, representing obviously the Soviet Union. And in this conference, they tried to lay out the plan for how Europe would be divided and reconstructed after the war. The most important thing that they decided at this conference was the future of Poland. Now, Poland had been invaded by the Soviets, pushing back the Nazis, and so it was under Soviet rule at the time of the Yalta Conference. And Stalin agreed, he compromised with the Allied powers, he agreed to allow some of the pre-war Polish government representatives in the new Soviet Polish government and to have free elections. He will obviously later violate this agreement. Another thing that they were able to agree upon nominally was the Declaration of Liberated Europe. This document asserted the right of all people to choose the form of government under which they will live. So in other words, every area of liberated Europe would decide what kind of government they wanted and would have free elections to make this government up. In the meantime, temporary governments would be established by the occupying power that would represent all democratic elements of that country. So, different Allied powers occupied different territories after the war and helped reconstruct that territory. And they would allow representative government to be formed according to the will of the people. Now, in the parts of Europe that were under the control of Great Britain, France, and the United States, this Declaration of Liberated Europe was respected. In the parts of Europe that were under Soviet domination, it was not respected. Germany was then divided into a number of zones, military zones, under which the reconstruction projects of Germany would take place. The Soviet zone was in the east, obviously, and it was mostly agricultural. The Soviet Union wanted reparations, strong, heavy reparations paid by Germany, a little bit like the Versailles Treaty at the end of World War I, but the other Allied powers realized that this would only backfire and would not be good for the rest of Europe if Germany was to be punished, and so they resisted the Soviet Union's demands. And it was helpful that most of the industrial Germany was in the east, and so Stalin was not able to squeeze out of the western, vice versa. Most of the industrial part was in the west, and Stalin was not able to squeeze out of the east part of Germany the reparations that he would have wanted. So Germany is divided into 4 military zones that you can see in the map, with the United States, France, and England dominating the western part of Germany, and the Soviet Union dominating the eastern part of Germany, which contains the capital city of Berlin, which is also divided into 4 military zones. So the city itself is divided into the zones of the French, British, Americans, and Soviets. Now, one of the first conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union came out with regard to Romania and Poland, where immediately the Soviet Union violated the Declaration of Liberated Europe. And they pressured Romania into appointing a communist government, and they refused to allow the free elections in Poland or the non-communist Poles in the government. So this sets the stage for a new balance of power, a delicate and dangerous balance of power in Europe between the Soviet Union that controls the countries in the East and the United States that's supporting the democratic governments in the West. For the most part, it's a matter of ideology and of systems of economics. So the Soviets believe that communism is the superior economic system and that it eventually would replace capitalism throughout the world, that it was only a matter of time, and that they realized that the capitalist countries would resist and would try to overthrow communism. And so there was this fundamental hatred between the two systems. Whereas the Americans were much more focused in general on the economic problems that were being faced throughout the world, both in America and in Europe, that need to be reconstructed. And they strongly believed that people would turn to systems like communism if they were suffering economically and if they were destitute. So they saw that when nations stopped trading, this would lead to war in order to get resources that were necessary for their growth, as we saw especially in Japan, for example. And so they saw that trade, free enterprise, private property rights, and the limited role of the government in the economy was the best route to prosperity and therefore world peace. And that would also help to influence countries to not turn towards systems like communism to resolve their economic problems. But what happens in Eastern Europe? Right away, FDR confronts Stalin on his violations of the accord at the Yalta Conference with regard to Poland. However, FDR dies 11 days later on April 12, 1945. The new president, Harry Truman, takes a strong stance against the Soviets. And then in the Potsdam Conference, the Soviets demand heavy reparations from Germany, but Truman stands up against them, and he declares that he wants Germany to recover completely, especially its industry and its trade, to be a strong member of the European body of nations. And so he refuses the Soviets' demands that reparations come from Western Germany to pay the Soviets for their losses in the war. However, he does compromise on the German-Polish border that the Soviets demand. So there's a little bit of give and take. Then, on August 8th, 1945, 2 days after the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on Japan, the Soviets enter the war against Japan, and they invade Manchuria, the northeastern part of China, to drive out the Japanese army in that territory. So this is one thing that also leads the Japanese to eventually capitulate and to sign the armistice with the United States and all the Allied powers. Then, with pressure from the Soviet army that is present in Eastern Europe, because they've not withdrawn their forces, pro-Soviet governments are established in many of the Eastern European countries: Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. And these are called satellite nations because they're controlled by the Soviet Union. They do not have absolute freedom in their governments. Their governments are puppet governments. So all of Eastern Europe is under the communist control, and they become cut off from the rest of the world. So Winston Churchill, when he was in the United States at the time, he made a speech in Missouri, and he referred to this cutting off of all of Eastern Europe as the falling of an Iron Curtain. And then this term was then used from then on to describe all of the countries in Eastern Europe that were cut off from the rest of the world and absorbed into the sphere of control of communist USSR. The American diplomat George Kennan was a diplomat who had worked in Moscow in the American embassy there, and had come to know quite well the Soviet mind, way of thinking, and their real goals in international diplomacy. And he, at the request of Washington, Washington DC, in other words, the government in America, he wrote a long telegram explaining these ideals and goals of the Soviet Union as he saw it from his perspective as a diplomat who had worked for a long time with the Soviets. And this long telegram essentially explains quite well what their mentality really was and what their ideas about capitalism were and what their plans for the future were. So it talks about, I'm quoting here, the Soviet Union could not foresee permanent peaceful coexistence with the West, right? So there could be no coexistence with capitalism. Communism and capitalism cannot live side by side. This neurotic view of world affairs was a manifestation of the instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. As a result, the Soviets were deeply suspicious of all other nations and believed that their security could only be found in patient but deadly struggle for total destruction of rival power. So this was their ultimate goal. It wasn't peaceful coexistence. Kennan was convinced that the Soviets would try to expand their sphere of influence, and he pointed to Iran and Turkey as the most likely immediate trouble areas, which in fact actually happens. So when, almost immediately after this telegram, when the Soviet Union moves into Iran and Turkey and tries to influence their governments there, Truman is forced to send American battleships and an American aircraft carrier into the Mediterranean Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, to threaten the Soviet Union and make them back down from their pressure in taking over both of these countries. So it was only a confirmation of Kennan's ideas. In addition, Kennan believed that the Soviets would do all they could to weaken power and influence of Western powers on colonial backward or independent peoples. So where the countries are underdeveloped and weak, the Soviets wanted to enter in and influence these people against Western powers. So this was going to be a struggle throughout the Cold War between the United States and the Soviets for who could get there first and influence these peoples who were weak and underdeveloped and therefore looking for any possibility on the horizon. Fortunately, although the Soviet Union was impervious to logic of reason, it was highly sensitive to logic of force. Therefore, it would back down when strong resistance is encountered at any point. The United States and its allies, he concluded, would have to offer that resistance. So, in order to block the spread of communism, the United States and anyone else who believed in true democracy and the ability of peoples to choose the kind of government that they want, would have to provide that resistance to stop the spread of communism. And if they did not, communism would spread, inevitably. So this basically is the foundation for the entire American Cold War policy of containment and strong military and economic resistance. So this was why the United States built up its military and supported the economies of many, many developing countries, and tried to maintain their policy of containment of the communist ideology. Truman Doctrine. All right, so we have all these doctrines that are constantly coming out. We have the Monroe Doctrine, we have the Roosevelt Corollary, and now we've got our Truman Doctrine. I have provided you here with an actual quote from Truman's speech because I wanted you to have before you what he actually said, so that his ideas were clear to you. But I will not ask you, obviously, for quotes. I will ask you to be able to tell me what is the Truman Doctrine, right? But I think it's so important that you really understand the reasoning behind America's movements to contain communism, because this Truman Doctrine really becomes the fundamental, the foundation, if you will, of all America's actions of intervention from the time of the Cold War even until today. All right, so this kind of gives a logic behind why does America go in? Why does America move? Now you can agree or you can disagree as to why, but this is the motivation. So Truman says in his speech to Congress right now, Truman is in front of the Congress asking for money to resist communist aggression in Greece and Turkey. So the communists are fighting and giving aid to Yugoslavia, who's giving aid to Greece. Eventually, the Soviets in Yugoslavia have a difference of opinion, and they stop aiding Yugoslavia, and so Greece eventually is secured and becomes part of the NATO nations and the organization that is formed, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So he's right in front of Congress asking for this support to resist the spread of communism. And this is what he says. At the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. The choice is too often not a free one, right? They're pressured into it. They're blocked. They are given only one choice, not two, so that's not free, right? One way of life is based upon the will of the majority and is distinguished by free institutions, representative government, free elections, guarantees of individual liberty, freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from political oppression. Okay, obviously that would be the choice supported by the United States. It doesn't always mean that it's a pure democracy, because remember, our founding fathers were not in favor of a pure democracy, right? But it has to be the will of the people. It has to be that they are free to choose. The second way of life is based upon the will of a minority, forcibly imposed upon the majority. It relies upon terror and oppression, and controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedoms. And that's what we found behind the Iron Curtain in the countries that were under the control of the Soviet Union. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjection by armed minorities or by outside pressures. What does that mean? That means the United States will help any country or any people who want to resist and who are trying to resist this overpowering by small armed minorities within their country, in other words, armed takeovers of the government, of the legitimate government, or by outside pressures, which would be, for example, the Soviet Union, the Soviet Army, the Soviet presence. I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. So that doesn't mean that America goes in and imposes something. I believe that our help should be primarily through economic and financial aid, which is essential to economic stability and orderly political processes. If there is not economical stability, then a country will often turn to drastic and radical measures. They will not feel that they are really free to make a choice. They will resort to following minorities who promise, economical stability for the country, etc. So they realize Truman and the Americans here realize that it's very fundamental, especially for a developing country, or in the case of Europe, countries that are trying to rebuild themselves, to have that economic stability and that order in society so that they can make a free choice. The world is not static, and the status quo is not sacred, but we cannot allow changes in the status quo in violation of the Charter of the United Nations by such methods as coercion, or by such subterfuges as political infiltration. In helping free and independent nations to maintain their freedom, the United States will be giving effect to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. So we're saying that America is only putting into effect what all the nations have agreed to. That these methods of coercion are not to be accepted, that political infiltration is not legitimate, and that nations must be respected in their freedom. So the United States is just putting into effect the principles that were approved by all the nations. The seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured by misery and want. Here again, we have a reference to this economic stability. If there's a lack in economic stability, all right, that's where totalitarian regimes are able to grow. They spread and grow in the evil soil of poverty and strife. They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died. Right? This is like the American dream, right? We must keep that hope alive. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedoms. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of our own nation. So it's in the interest of the United States, yes, and it's in the interest of world peace. So the arms race, the economic race that comes to develop between the United States and the Soviet Union is not in vision of war, but it's in vision of peace. So what happens? We already mentioned the Marshall Plan in the slides on the Second World War because I wanted to emphasize the difference between the end of World War I and the end of World War II. At the end of World War I, we remember the Versailles Treaty basically set up a situation of humiliation and economic crushing that made a Second World War almost inevitable. Whereas at the end of World War II, we see the Allied powers reconstruct their own enemies, Germany and Japan. And the reconstruction of Europe comes in the form of the Marshall Plan. This plan is a recovery program for all of Europe, so both Allied nations and nations that were at war with the Allied powers, and it gave economic aid, billions of dollars to Germany especially, and supplies, machinery, food, and whatnot. This would also help in the struggle against communism, because as we read previously with the Truman Doctrine, communism grows and spreads in areas where there is strife and poverty and difficulties economically. Then there's the Point 4 program, which was a separate program, same kind of idea, in the sense that it would provide scientific advances and industrial progresses for those nations that needed to be developed and grow. So it was a way of spreading technologies to those countries that did not yet have it at their disposition for their advancement and their growth. Then we have the merging of West Germany, and the formation of West Germany. So the merging of the military zones of Britain, France, and the US into what becomes the Federal Republic of Germany. As a response, then the Soviet Union creates their government in East Germany under their power, called the German Democratic Republic. And Stalin does not want Germany's recovery, obviously, and so they blockade West Berlin and do not allow the Allies to come and go through East Germany in order to get to the city of Berlin, to their area, their military zones. And they try to basically starve West Berlin. So the United States responded by sending in aircraft that would drop supplies. They didn't want to, create an armed conflict with the Soviet Union and start another world war. So they bypassed the approach to Berlin, and they flew in supplies, and this is the famous Berlin airlift, which occurred from June 1948 to the spring of 1949. About 2 million tons of supplies were flown into Berlin to keep the city fed and to maintain them on their feet. Finally, Stalin backed down and he lifted the blockade in May of 1949. The United States also moved atomic weapons to Great Britain in order to make the Soviet Union feel the pressure and the resistance that the United States would give to their hostilities. Then the Americans formed a mutual defense alliance with all the Western European countries. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed, which is well known as NATO. Originally it included the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Italy, Belgium, Denmark, Portugal, the Netherlands, Norway, Luxembourg, and Iceland. After a few years, I already mentioned when there was the conflict in Turkey and Greece, that eventually Greece was liberated from communist control and it to join NATO. And then about 6 years after the founding of NATO, West Germany was allowed to join and rearm itself. When this happened, the Soviets responded by forming their own mutual defense alliance with the Eastern European countries that were under their control, and this was called the Warsaw Pact. So this gives you a little idea of the situation in Europe at this time. The black line is the Iron Curtain that descends on Eastern Europe. Yugoslavia sometimes is included in this territory and sometimes it's excluded. As you see right now in this map, it's excluded. There was a time when Yugoslavia was under a communist-influenced government, and then there was a conflict between their government and Moscow, and they disassociated themselves officially with the Soviet Union, and so here, as you see in this map, they are considered non-aligned, a non-aligned country, which means that they're not on anybody's side. They're not in the Allied camp, and they're not in the Soviet camp. But for a time, they had been friends with the Soviet Union and had been supporting the overtake of Greece. After the United States and Great Britain supported Greece and allowed them to join the NATO organization, Yugoslavia at that point was not on good terms with the Soviet Union. So it gives you an idea of Europe and how it's now divided. And this lasts for a long time. The Korean War. This is a whole war that I've put on one slide. So after World War II, the civil war in China that had been raging before World War II started back up again. And this was a civil war between the communist Mao Zedong and the nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek. Now, the nationalist leader obviously was supported by the United States, but they did not have a good organization in their army or in their politics, and they eventually were defeated and pushed out of mainland China, and they fled to the island of Taiwan. Now, under the U.S. Influence in the United Nations, they maintained their seat in the Council, and the Communist People's Republic of China was not allowed to take over that seat as the official government of China for quite some time. Now, the Soviets, having another communist nation right next door, they were very happy about this, and they decided to sign a treaty of friendship and alliance with the People's Republic of China. So now Japan becomes a very key position in Asia because it's under the control of the United States after World War II, and the United States realizes that it's going to be a very important element to try to stop the spread of communism in Asia. And so here again we have the step up of the economic reconstruction of Japan on the part of the United States in order to help contain the spread of communism. So Japan had occupied Korea during the war, and now Allied powers moved into Korea after the war, and the country was divided, very much like East and West Europe, was divided on the 38th parallel between the Soviet-controlled territory in North Korea and the American-controlled territory in South Korea. On June 25th, 1950, the Communist North Korean army invaded South Korea. And you can see on this map, I hope you can kind of blow it up on your computers when I save it all, because it shows quite clearly the development of the war. The points are numbered so you can see the order of the movements of the troops, etc. So point number 1, it shows the 38th parallel where Korea is divided. Point number 2, it shows in 1950, in June, that the North Koreans move into South Korea and invade, pushing essentially the Allied powers, which would be the South Koreans and the Americans, and essentially the UN under American control, down to the corner of South Korea. So they're hanging on to a piece of South Korea. Meanwhile, Douglas MacArthur, who was the military commander of the army in the Pacific and who was in charge of the reconstruction of Japan, was sent with a UN force, which was mainly American, to counterattack. And he lands at Incheon, which you can see is number 3 on the map, in September of 1950. Surprising the North Koreans, because now he's behind them, and he crushes them and pushes them back into North Korea, and he keeps on pushing them so far, all the way up to the border with China in the Yalu River. So he's been very successful, and he wants to go beyond that point, but Truman is worried about basically leading the world into a World War III, and is not quite interested in that at the moment. And MacArthur publicly criticizes some of Truman's policies, and so Truman has to fire him for insubordination. However, MacArthur comes back to the United States as a war hero because everybody loves him for what he did during World War II and what he did for the reconstruction of Japan, and also for his successful counterattack in Korea. So he's definitely praised for all of his successes. But the United States policy now in Korea was to maintain a limited war. They did not want to start World War III, and they had a limited objective of containing communism. So they didn't want North Korea to come down and take over South Korea. That would not be containing communism, obviously. So the new president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, in 1953, signs the armistice. The North Koreans had been helped now by China, who had pushed in with their forces. The Chinese supported the North Koreans, and so he signs the armistice, and the boundary between North Korea and South Korea is set very much near the old 38th parallel. So during this war, about 5 million people died, most of whom were civilians. So it was a very short but very bloody conflict. About 40,000 Americans died in Korea, and more than 100,000 were wounded. Now the United States forms a similar pact of mutual defense in the Pacific zone with Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, and this is called the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. And essentially this treaty organization still exists today. And so the United States formally will defend these countries. And we did see recently an escalation of hostilities between North Korea and South Korea. And obviously the United States pledged their defense of South Korea and Japan in the event of any sort of aggression on the part of North Korea. So this whole escalation, I guess if you will, of hostilities between the Soviet Union and the United States is bringing about a second and even more important episode of what we call the Red Scare, the fear of the takeover by communism. So how does this get touched off basically in the United States is that in September of 1945, a Soviet embassy worker, Ignor Gudzenko, defects. Defects means to go from one side to the other. So he becomes a traitor to the Soviets. So he defects and takes with him many documents, secret documents from the Soviet Union's embassy that prove the Soviet effort to infiltrate the United States government agencies and to subvert, which means to try to work at weakening the society and overthrowing its government, and to obtain information about the atomic bomb, because this was America's only real advantage at the moment, is they had nuclear power and no other country did. And everybody had seen the worth of this power at the end of World War II. So the second Red Scare begins, and Truman establishes the Loyalty Review Program, which basically is a background check for all federal employees to make sure that they're really loyal to the American government and are not communist sympathizers. The House Un-American Activities Committee started investigating many people throughout the United States who were accused of subversive activities. Right? So subversive activities would be activities that promote anarchy or the active overthrow of the government, and not just a communistic economic idea. Right? So it's not like to take away your freedom of opinion, but it's actual activities towards the subversion of the government or of society. Many Hollywood actors and directors were brought in these investigations, and they were blacklisted, so Hollywood would not hire these people, and movies were instead made that promoted this anti-communist mentality. People like the Rosenbergs, who were a very famous couple, husband and wife, who had been spies for the Soviet Union and had helped get atomic bomb secrets to the Soviets. They were actually executed for espionage. And some people said that they were not guilty, but later the Project Venona was revealed in the 1990s that in 1946 British and American cryptographers were able to crack the Soviet spy code, and many of the accusations during this period that were made in the House Un-American Activities Committee were confirmed by the data that they were able to get from Project Venona. Another important person, well-known case at the time, was the defector Whittaker Chambers, who was a former communist who had information and proof of communist spies in the American government. The highest American diplomat that was accused and convicted of his communist ties was Alger Hiss, who is a high-level diplomat in FDR's administration. Excuse me. Then, in 1949, the Soviets were able to test their own atomic bomb, and they entered into the atomic era. So this made the Red Scare in America all the more intense. Also, the fall of China to communism made the American public fear that they were losing in the struggle against communism, in the spread of communism. Senator Joseph McCarthy is very well known at this moment for his investigations of the allegations against possible communists. He is often blamed for doing what they would call witch hunting. So witch hunting is kind of like finding fault where there is no real proof and just flinging about accusations. Oftentimes this accusations without real proof and these unfounded charges, which end up ruining somebody's reputation, now has actually become a term in the English language which is called McCarthyism. So it's taken obviously from his name, this method of damaging reputations with unfounded charges. Not all of his accusations, however, were unfounded, but this has become a stereotypical reference to him. And throughout America, many were so afraid of a possible nuclear war that they actually started building fallout shelters, which would be like bomb shelters, but more specifically for an atomic bomb, which technically I don't think would be very helpful, or they certainly wouldn't defend you from the radiation that then would kill you after the dust had settled. But this was the mentality with which people were living. Schools even had drills, bombing drills, where the children would go underneath their desks, etc., almost the same as an earthquake drill. But obviously, in the case of a bomb, it would do very little to save one's life. Here you actually have a picture of children in a classroom who are even smiling during one of their drills, of them all crawling underneath their desks. Now, brinkmanship. I have a picture here. The smaller picture is Dwight D. Eisenhower, who is the president now at this time. And the other picture, end quote, is from John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State at the time under Eisenhower. So it kind of explains a little bit of what brinkmanship is. The ability to get to the verge without getting into the war is the necessary art. If you are scared to go to the brink, you are lost. The brink is the edge, right? The limit, the actual limit, right? So Eisenhower, remember, he is the overall commander of the American forces in Europe during World War II. So he's a great military hero. He was the commander of all Allied forces at the D-Day invasion. He understands military strength. He understands international politics. And he sees that the key to victory in this struggle with the Soviet Union is not in our conventional warfare methods, which he is an expert in, but is actually in having a strong economy and showing the world that free enterprise system can produce a better society than communism. All right? So he is saying, no, we need to prove to the world and give concrete evidence that our system works and the other one doesn't. And instead of using conventional warfare, we need to use the advantage we have in nuclear weapons. That way we can have what he calls more bang for the buck. He needs to stimulate the economy, so he cuts back on military spending, but he invests greatly in nuclear weapons. And so the nuclear development in this period was quite extensive. And he would, at any moment when there was a threat from the Soviet Union, he would then use the nuclear threat called massive retaliation. So this would be a way of retaliating, getting back in a massive way, right? The biggest way. Some criticized this because they thought it was too dangerous. And so the brinkmanship is not always considered a positive term. It depends who's looking at it, right? However, it seemed to work because every time Eisenhower actually moved military ships into the region with nuclear warheads, or every time he sent planes to another country to be near the point of attack with nuclear weapons, the Soviet Union would back down. So what Kennan had said in his long telegram was true, that the Soviets responded to shows of force. And so this brinkmanship was also a result of Kennan's long telegram and his advice about the Soviets and how they react. When Taiwan, for example, was threatened by China, the US threatened to use nuclear warfare on China. And of course, China at the moment didn't have nuclear weapons, although they probably would have been able to be supported by the Soviet Union with their nuclear weapons, but they immediately backed down because they knew that America was capable of using these terrible new weapons. Instead, there was a conflict in Egypt where the Egyptian troops seized the Suez Canal. British and French troops invaded to try to take over and recontrol the Suez Canal. The Soviets promised to help the Egyptians, and we could kind of see the development of another world war, World War III. Eisenhower wanted to really avoid the outbreak of war again, so did the Soviet Union. He moved nuclear forces in the area and was prepared for anything that might come, but he pressured the British and the French to remove their troops in order to not create a greater conflict, and peace eventually was restored. But this was a major victory for the Soviets in the end, because now the Arab nations began accepting Soviet aid and slowly coming under Soviet control. So this was one moment of failure on the part of the containment of communism. But communism could not always be contained by this brinkmanship method. This could help prevent Soviet intervention and pressure from outside, a possible takeover of another country by the Soviet Union. But this couldn't prevent the communists within a country from staging a coup or overthrowing the government from within, right? So how did Eisenhower try to face this problem of communist takeover in developing countries from within, these minority armed groups within a country. His main method was to use covert operations within the country itself. And he did this through the Central Intelligence Agency, the famous CIA. The CIA worked in many countries throughout the world to prevent the spread of communism. Many of these developing countries had blamed European imperialism and American capitalism for their problems, their oppression, and so it was natural for them to look to the enemy of these systems, that is communism, to get out of the oppression they were suffering. And so one way of helping, the principal way of helping these countries was through financial aid. And so the United States would try to build up, again, the economy and the structure in the country and give financial and economical aid to the country for their stability. The other method that the CIA would use was to help overthrow pro-communist leaders in the country and support those leaders within that country who were pro-American. Right? So when there was a conflict, an internal conflict in a country or a civil war within a country between two different leaders, the CIA would throw their support and their help behind the pro-American leader. In 1953, Stalin dies and Nikita Khrushchev takes over in the Soviet Union. He gives a secret speech to his party officials where he talks about the ideals now of the Soviet Union under his control and what their objectives were, etc. This speech was leaked to the CIA, which means it was given secretly to the CIA, and they printed copies of this speech and distributed it in all of Eastern Europe. So these countries that are under the control of the Soviets, to get a true vision of what Khrushchev's idea of communism was. This stimulated many uprisings in Eastern Europe, and the most important was the uprising in Hungary. However, in the communist behind the Iron Curtain zone, the Soviets simply moved in with tanks and crushed militarily the uprising in Hungary. So that was a devastating blow and was an example to other countries that might have wanted to try the same thing, that the communists, the Soviets, were not going to allow any resistance of their ideology. Now, the Eisenhower Doctrine was essentially an extension of Truman's doctrine, specifically in the zone of the Middle East. So he specifically asked Congress to be able to use any military power necessary to assist Middle Eastern countries that wanted to resist communist aggression. So if a country asked America for help to resist communist invasion, he would be able to immediately give that military assistance. And the first one to almost immediately ask for aid was Lebanon, because they feared that they would be the next nation to fall, and so they asked for American aid, which America gave immediately, and they did resist the communist takeover. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, which was the first artificial satellite in space. It was a successful launch and basically began what we call the space race. In other words, who is going to be able to take over space and conquer that territory as a military objective and having it as an advantage against the other country. So now we have the satellite race and the dominance in space. The last major hostility, of which we will discuss in this moment, was the American U-2 spy plane that was shot down by the Soviets. It flew over a Soviet zone, and it was shot down by the Soviets. And this only heightened the hostilities at the time between the Soviet Union and the United States. So this brings us to the end of the beginning of the Cold War. I've placed here a timeline to help you guys see the whole spectrum. All right, so we've obviously covered only the first block. The last date that's marked here that we've covered, it was 1956, the Hungarian Revolution. All right, so all of those dates before, from 1945, the Yalta Congress, to 1956, we've covered in this slideshow. The later dates will obviously be addressed in later lessons, but this timeline gives you the overall picture. So you can see that the Cold War, obviously lasts until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. So it's a series of events that happen all the way through. Also, the video that I have here is a really quick summary of the whole Cold War. I think it was done quite well. It's a little off with regard to the Vietnam War, but that will be cleared up on our Vietnam lesson. But it gives a good step-by-step of the whole Cold War in 7 minutes. So I think it's worth looking at to help clear up any confusions in your mind. So thanks a lot, and I'll see you later.